Hey, this is Cedric, and welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. On this podcast, we explore the economic, cultural, and psychological implications of Bitcoin through philosophical conversations. Today, we're joined by Luke Broyles to discuss the revolutionary impact of Bitcoin on society. Make sure to subscribe to the Bitcoin Matrix and crunch that like button if you're watching this on YouTube. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a fresh and dope episode. This episode is brought to you by River, the financial institution built for all time. With 100% full reserve custody and zero fees on recurring orders, River allows you to buy and mine Bitcoin with ease. Plus, River offers unparalleled service and functionality, including tax optimization, entity accounts, inheritance planning, and instant buy volume. Use the link in the show notes to get started and receive $20 free when you buy Bitcoin at river.com or on the River app. And for the ultimate in security, check out the Cold Card hardware wallet from CoinKite. With built-in sleep at night technology, it's the only dedicated air-gapped, ultra-secure hardware wallet for Bitcoin. Use the link in the show notes for 5% off your order at CoinKite. And now, let's enter the Bitcoin Matrix and explore the world's first perfect money with Luke Broyles.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Luke Broyles is a 24-year-old investor and critical thinker. Being a real estate investor and hardcore Bitcoin advocate, he spends much of his time perfecting his Bitcoin thesis. As a follower of Jesus, Broyles is passionate about spreading the truth of the gospel and doing everything he can to build a better world for his family, as well as families in developing nations. He is currently taking classes offered by Harvard University and hopes that his influence online and in his community can inspire others to take bold, calculated risks, making the future brighter. Luke Broyles, welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. How are you?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to join.
Yeah, man, I'm excited to get into it. You're kind of blowing up on Twitter, putting a lot of great ideas and even in podcasts as well. So I'd love to get into some of these ideas. But first, I'd love to get into a little bit about, maybe your background and what you were into before Bitcoin.
Yeah, I see you found the bio from I think it was my Citadel 21 article or so. It was one of the first bios I did for the Bitcoin space. That's funny. It feels like forever ago. That was just a couple months ago, I suppose. But so about me, I have a background mostly in the filmmaking world. I love movies. I love watching movies, making movies, especially when I was younger. That was a huge fascination to me. And my joy in filmmaking and telling stories were telling stories that, made the world a better place. I've been very fortunate to travel a lot for filmmaking. I traveled a lot through the United States. I made a documentary a long time ago. I went to Mali, Africa, before it's become a lot more violent there now. But before that was the case, I made a documentary there. I'm currently in post-production 2 films. One of them, which that'll be finished first, is a short movie. I went on a mission trip to Guatemala back in February of 2023. And so I'm making a short little film about the people there and just documenting their stories, because that's one of those places in the world that frankly gets written off as the poor areas of the world. And I think Westerners typically forget about that. But the reality is that, all these developing nations, they all have different cultures, different stories, and different challenges from each other in different ways. So very similar challenges and different challenges. So anyway, I'm making a documentary about that. But that's the majority of my background. And one of the things I loved and still love about filmmaking is the fact that so many different fields come together. You have very technical fields like working with cameras or like with editing software and post-production. And then you also have music, which I love music so much. I don't play anything seriously. I play a little bit, but anyway, I love music. And so always having the score come in is one of my favorite things, as well as, then you have the creative side. You get to write and tell a story. And so really it's just that variety of things that always really engaged me. And that's how I just stand about life too. I've always loved science. I've always loved physics. I've always loved history. I love American history. 20th century history is very fascinating to me. And always for most of my life, thinking about history, where I'm in history, my family could verify all this to anyone out there that, it's like my whole life I've been like, wow, this time has passed, and if that same time in the future is this time, it's like time, relation to time, and understanding the human story. That's always been a fascination to me. And I was talking about this in a recent podcast with someone else, but in retrospect, I think probably one of the largest contributions to me understanding Bitcoin as early as I have, and that's not to say, I've only been Bitcoin only for 2 years or so, but we're very early, and all of us are here, I believe, by extreme circumstances. I think it's incredibly improbable that people would discover this early, and so I think for me, the way at which I discovered it, in large part, is due to that varied background of thinking about the world at large, thinking about the developing world and the difficulties that those people have. Obviously inflation is a problem everywhere, but it's a really big problem overseas. In fact, today I just posted a podcast with someone from Kenya. We talked about Kenya's inflation crisis. This is over my YouTube channel. We talked about what Kenya is facing and the challenges there. I don't know. It's just fascinating to me. But yeah, I think that background of having seen with my own eyes what that world is like, and having seen that for most of my life, or at least most of my adult life, I think that was a major contribution that really gave me the passion to find the solution to this problem. I think also my fascination of physics, my fascination of astronomy, black holes. I love black holes, which is kind of ironic because now obviously Bitcoin's a black hole, monetary black hole. But thinking in those terms of time, and thinking in those terms of exponentials and orders of magnitude, I think those set my brain up in a sense that once Bitcoin entered, and once it simmered there for months and a couple of years, it finally began to make sense in context of all these other things, in context of thinking about the developing world, and thinking about orders of magnitude and science and energy, in terms of thinking about history and technological progress and where we are in the human story. I think, as Bitcoiners often joke, there's like so many different rabbit holes and so many different fields of expertise that one can fall into once they start studying Bitcoin. And I think for me, it was that varied fascination in things that helped it click for me. And so I'm very grateful to be here. Like you said, yeah, I kind of blew up in Twitter. It's been a lot. It's been wonderful. I'm busier than I've ever been in my life, which, and strangely enough, I've never been happier. So it's been wonderful, and it's been so much fun to meet people online and hear so many different perspectives of people all over the world. I get to talk to people from all kinds of different countries and backgrounds, and anyway, it's just fascinating. So that's kind of how I ended up here. And then the rest of the story I've told before, so I guess I won't go into too much here. But basically, I first heard of Bitcoin 2017. I ignored it. I didn't really look into it deeply, and I often wonder what would have happened if I did. However, I don't beat myself up too much about it, because what if I had looked into it and I wasn't emotionally mature enough to have understood it? I might have ignored it, and I might still be ignoring it to this day. So I don't regret it too much. But I ignored it 2017, 2018, 2019. Late 2019, I started having interest in it again. I watched multiple documentaries on Bitcoin. Obviously, filmmaking documentary background. I'm like, okay, I'll just watch a couple of documentaries on it. And yeah, they were interesting to me, but I was so far from fully understanding the complete implications of it. So then, of course, 2020 happens. The world changes. Most people watching this, probably, that's when they really started going hard to Bitcoin and continued. I talked to dozens and dozens of people. Like, most of them are 2020, either deep in their conviction or they began their conviction. So, of course, 2020, that's when I really started getting into it and trying to figure out, like, okay, this is a problem. This problem is a lot farther along and a lot deeper and a lot worse than I previously understood. What's the solution? And then, I realized, okay, Bitcoin, this is a major solution. And then there was about a year and a half of trying to understand the difference between Bitcoin and crypto, proof of stake versus proof of work, and really trying to hammer home in my own mind, like, okay, is this a dual world where both proof of work, proof of stake have a use case, or is it plural and that proof of stake is vastly superior, or is it plural that proof of work is or is it singular that proof of work is vastly superior, or is it some other thing? And so I went down those rabbit holes, and on the other side of it, it's become obvious to me personally that proof of work is superior to proof of stake, that proof of stake is essentially the same thing that we have today, and that therefore if proof of work is dominant over proof of stake, then the dominant proof of work chain will dominate all other chains, whether they're crypto chains or they're Federal Reserve chains or political chains or corporate chains. Like no matter what ledger we're talking about, the dominant proof of work ledger seems to me to be able to dominate. And obviously, as most people watching this know, Bitcoin of all the proof of work chains is like 99%, 95%, 99.5%. There is no second best, as Saylor says. So yeah, that's essentially my story. That I'm very grateful I had that very background, and I'm very grateful I was born when I was. I wonder often what would have happened if I was born a couple years early, a couple years later. If I was born a couple years earlier, I might have been a couple years older, maybe a wife and some kids. And while that's all wonderful, I might not have had the time to go down the rabbit hole. And then if I was any younger, well, then obviously I'm buying Bitcoin later than I am now in my own life. So anyway, all that to say is that I am very grateful to be here. I'm very grateful to have this following on Twitter. I think a lot of it is the work I've put in, the value I've put in, and the insights I've had. But I think a lot of it also is frankly circumstance. I don't believe in karma per se or anything like that, but I do see how much of it is just being in the right place in the right time with the right background and the right interest, frankly. And I think most of us in the space now kind of have a similar story if we really wanted to think about it, that yes, we put in the work, but we're so early that we're all like anomalies, basically.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. Right off the top of my head, I mean, I think about, sort of, luck is sort of when, preparation sort of meets opportunity, and I kind of talk about my son with this. It's like, if you come home and get your homework done, and then someone knocks on the door and they're like, dude, I'm going to this awesome party. You want to come? And you're like, yeah, man, I'm so lucky I got my homework done. I can go. Whereas if you don't, like, you're like, wow, I'm unlucky. I didn't know this opportunity was going to come my way. I'm not prepared to take advantage of this. And that's just me trying to get him his homework done. And I don't even think homework should exist, but that's a whole different conversation. And,
Yeah,
I also, I mean, I have a filmmaking background.
I
I
didn't know
took
that. Okay.
a detour from my finance and accounting career, and I went to film school, and I made films, and I worked in production. I worked in film and TV, feature films and television, and I went on to become a controller for a really dynamic, moving reality television company, which like kind of a bore reality television, But yeah, I mean, it's kind of with Bitcoin. I mean, I remember getting into learning about it, and just there wasn't a lot of quality content. There weren't people, weren't a lot of the story wasn't being told well to me very quickly. The memes were striking, but I had to kind of unpack them and learn the stories and all the narratives behind and the history, quite honestly, of a lot of different subjects. While we're talking about filmmaking, I'd love to hear what your current project is. I know you just tweeted about it. I think you're making some sort of movie, the case for Bitcoin, I believe it's called.
Yeah, that's the working title right now. If someone wants to suggest a better title, I'm open to that. But yeah, that's the working title right now. Thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, I'm pleasant surprise there. Yeah, so like you said, which by the way, I didn't know you had filming background. That's awesome. But like you said, I feel there is a massive shortage for Bitcoin video content that's in like a feature film format. You don't get me wrong, there are plenty of video essays, there's plenty of podcasts, there's plenty of everything. There's I don't want to say there's an oversaturation because clearly there's not, but in relation to everything else, I feel that Bitcoin films are massively lacking. And I think that makes sense, frankly, because feature films just take such, or feature documentary films, feature narrative films, they take such a higher amount of proof of work. They take so much more effort to make. And that's not to say books don't take effort. That's not to say podcasts don't take effort. But I think there just hasn't been the incentive for production companies or Hollywood or major media companies to put in the investment into that, because who's going to watch it? Like 10,000 Bitcoin nerds on Twitter and Reddit. I mean, so I think that makes sense that of all the forms of media for education for Bitcoin, that's the one that would be lacking. I have watched many, pretty much all of the Bitcoin documentaries out there, which granted it's not a long list, but there's some good ones out there. Like, I don't want to say there aren't, there are really good ones out there. However, I think that frankly, most of them are already geared towards people that are technically minded, or geared towards people that have an interest in blockchain. And so Bitcoin's like a very small part of the documentary. Or some of them I think are just so over the head of a lot of people. And that's not to say that most people are dumb. That's just to say that most people are not on the wavelength of Bitcoiners, because most of us are coming to this already understanding bonds, already understanding the problem with fiat currencies, understanding these problems. And I think most people don't even realize those problems exist. Kind of like the name of your podcast, the Bitcoin Matrix. It's like, I think that's why the Matrix has become such a popular meme for Bitcoin over the last 3, 5, 7 years, whatever. It's because it's the same idea, is that this thing fixes a problem that most people don't even realize is a problem in the first place. And so all that to say is that, as I've been thinking over the last year, really, but especially the last few months, of what is one of the biggest, my goal is to increase the probability of Bitcoin success. Granted, it's already like 99%, but I care so much about this. I believe there's so many lives on at stake here. And if the one-shot principle is true, which I think there's a high probability it is, then basically I can't excuse anything other than just giving this my all, expanding Bitcoin's network and deepening conviction of current Bitcoiners as much as possible. I think that's I think that's the only thing that makes sense for my time, frankly, when it comes to protecting the future, my children's future, my own personal future. To me, that's the only thing that makes sense. Kind of like Sailor, the Sailor meme, again, coming back to memes, there is no second best meme, where Sailor says, take all your time and buy Bitcoin, take all, or take all your money and buy Bitcoin, they take all your time. I think it's the same thing, that I'm trying to find the way to maximize the number of people that become Bitcoiners and the number of people that deepen their conviction in Bitcoin, because I think both of those are equally important. And I think that a visually striking and visually engaging feature film is one of those ways that perhaps right now is lacking. When I think of the next 3 years or so, the next bull market and the coming wave of new adopters and all that, I think that's going to be something very useful to people. I don't think most people will read 5 books or 10 books. And frankly, it's hard enough to even get time to read 2 books. I don't think most people are going to watch, 100 hours of podcasts or 300 hours of podcasts or audiobooks for that matter. Some will, many will. Obviously, you and I have, and most people watching this have. But until people get over that threshold of, hey, I actually care about this now, they won't do that. And most people, they don't care, because to them it's a number on a screen, and they view themselves as risk averse, and so they don't even want to put in the time of learning about this online speculation, because they want safe, secure things like real estate and gold, maybe, and they don't have that connection there. Yet they don't understand that Bitcoin is not this get rich quick scheme, which is what most people think it is, including I thought that at one point. But it's actually the complete inverse of our expectations. And so all that to say is that, yeah, that's the goal of the movie. The goal of the movie is to make something that is visually engaging, intellectually engaging, while progressing from the very basics, still in an interesting manner, up and up and up and up, and just stay at those big picture ideas, so that hopefully in the future, Bitcoiners can just send it to people, or people will find out online or whatever, and it will string them along the whole way. Probably the first third of the movie is not even going to mention Bitcoin, but besides the title, of course. But basically, that's the essential idea. Some of my threads and articles online that have been really popular for that same idea, and that it's like a Trojan horse, orange pill. And so all that to say is that I think understanding the problem is crucial. And I think if a piece of content can be made that defines the problem so well for people, whether they're currently Bitcoiners or becoming Bitcoiners, or just trying to learn the case for it, the thesis for it. I think defining the problem is most of the work. Like again with the matrix, defining the problem makes the answer obvious. If you're in the matrix, you don't even realize there is a problem. But once you unplug and you look around, then the problem becomes apparent, and then you immediately can place yourself in that problem. So then immediately you care about the problem and you care about fixing the problem. And then once you go down that rabbit hole, then eventually you'll come to the solution. If you're thinking honestly and you're thinking critically and you actually care, which if you understand the problem better than most people, then you probably are all those things. So that's the basic idea of the project. It will take a lot of work and it will take a lot of time. I've already put a lot of work. I've written the whole script, volunteering my time, basically just because I care about it. And that's so I can break that down more. I don't want to go on and on about it, but that's the basic idea that I think this needs to be done. And I'm sure other people are working on their own projects, and I hope all the success to them too, because this needs to be done. I just hope that I can be of some contribution.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an appetite for it, especially as adoption increases, even at this very, very early stage. I think one of the biggest challenges with sort of the documentary format is the fast moving nature of Bitcoin and dealing with things like ordinals. I feel like almost like once or twice a year, there's things that happen in Bitcoin or to Bitcoin or around Bitcoin that if are not addressed in the content, it makes almost feels the content is stale or old or done. So like I try to make all my shows evergreen and the interviews evergreen, but I feel like once or twice a year, if like China bans mining, like any content I recorded like 3 days before that is like almost like, how come you're not asking the person about what just the most biggest event in the space, And but I really yearn for a fictional narrative drama or even dramedy. I could see something around brothers. One brother is very, low time preference, one's high time preference. You can get into a lot of family drama there and learning about money. I'd like to see something like that, or a Bitcoin billionaires even, maybe more social network style. But I would like to kind of dig a little into these concepts of time and exponentials and orders of magnitude through maybe the lens of empires. So how do the rise and fall of empires get faster and faster, and what do we glean from that for money?
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that for me really blew my mind. I think for most people, when they first understand it, whether they're hearing it from me or they realize it on their own, I think just helps things make so much sense. Because again, with history, how are we taught history? We're taught names and dates and faces and blah 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 blah. But I think when you step back and you look at the longer curve of history, instead of okay, this whole semester we're going to be studying this little slice. I think when you understand the foundational roots of what causes these cycles, I think it just helps everything make so much more sense, to where that memorizing the dates and the names of the places becomes so much easier. And so what are those fundamental forces? Well, fundamentally, all life functions on energy. And every living creature, from a microorganism to humans to whales, or dinosaurs, whatever. Everything is about energy. We take in energy, we use the energy, we survive, we reproduce, and then we die when we're no longer using or taking in or modifying energy. And so energy is the baseline. And humans, what makes us different, and one of the things that makes us different, is that we use technology to manipulate energy, to be more productive, to be more efficient. We consume more energy, we produce more energy. And so essentially, if all of life is built, it survives at top energy, and humans manipulate energy via technology, well, then what causes a group of people, what causes a civilization to have more energy and therefore be more dominant over another civilization, is its ability to use and channel technology and innovation. And so when you understand that, then you realize, oh, an empire is rising when its innovation is improving, when it's using more energy, when its population is going up, when its energy in relation to all the other empires or nations in the world is going up, then it's rising and rising and rising. And what happens when it's falling? Well, it's the complete inverse. Population starts to decline. There's less innovation. Things are destroyed. There's more destruction and chaos than stability and truth. It's that same idea. And so why are they getting faster and faster? Why are empires rising faster and collapsing faster? is because we are able to manipulate energy via technology at a faster and faster rate. Because as we build atop our previous set of knowledge, every generation adds more knowledge to our global collective of information. Then as that builds, then our ability to build atop that gets faster and faster too. So I think China is just an excellent example of this. Let's be real here. Less than a century ago, they were a communist dictatorship, and they still are pretty much. But they were in extreme poverty. And now, 30, 40, 50 years later, they are, let's see, I think they already are the number one economy in the world. Perhaps number two, they were number two, and I think they already might be number one. But, and obviously that's due to a large population as well, but that still doesn't negate the point that their population has exploded, that their ability to manipulate energy has exploded, their technology has exploded. And now much of the developing world has loans with them and agreements with them. Now you have the whole BRICS discussion going on. China has become a major global player in just the last few decades because they have a large population. That large population could be leveraged via technology at moving massive amounts of energy. And that's being manifested in monetary energy, military energy, political energy in terms of, unfortunately, tyranny. That's been radical. It's unlike anything ever in history. America grew really fast. It grew much faster than England did, let's say, and China has dwarfed us. It's been, miraculous for people living there. And then on the flip side, probably, unfortunately, let's be real, if there are going to be collapses of various societies, cultures, or nations this century, they're probably going to be faster than anything we've seen in history before. And so China, for example, it's pretty universally understood by anyone with a basic understanding of demographics that China's population collapse and is pretty much baked in at this point, and it's going to be tremendously faster than anything else we've seen in history. And likewise in America here, using us as an example, we've had this massive boom over the last 50 years. We have had incredible progress. Our average standard of living has just exploded. And likewise, if our banking sector or if our monetization and financialization of everything were to decline in the future, as I happen to believe, it's probably going to be really, really fast, unlike anything we've ever seen before. And so that's why the Bitcoin message is really important, because it's this optimistic and pessimistic view of optimistic being that innovation is happening and it's happening faster than it's ever happened before. Like, you literally can't keep up with all the changes that are happening. Like, every week now, there are societal shifting innovations occurring that a decade ago would have been mind-blowing. And that's not what's amazing. What's amazing is in 5 years, it'll probably be even more than that. Maybe 20% faster, maybe 10% faster, but one way or another, it's probably going to be even faster in the future. That's the optimistic viewpoint. And then the pessimistic viewpoint being that as that innovation occurs, it's going to replace the former faster than ever before. And, the internet being a good example of that. And that and this is what, and I emphasize this because this is one of the things people, I got so much hate recently on Twitter for one of my bullish, comments on Bitcoin, because people are like, oh, you're just rooting for the demise of fiat, the demise of baking or whatever. You shouldn't be so gleeful in celebrating. And it's like that wasn't the point at all. It's like, if we take the internet, what is the adoption of the internet? It's the fastest adoption of a communications network in human history. And the downside, or the pessimistic side, is that it was the fastest collapse of a communications paradigm in human history. The newspaper and radio, all those things collapsed so fast, unlike anything ever before in history. And so all that to say is that your question of why are empires rising and falling so quickly just comes down to technology. It comes down to energy. It comes down to demographics. And it comes down to that basic reality that as generations build atop each other, the rise and fall of energy, technologies, currencies, and paradigms is getting faster and faster. And that's both a beautiful and a terrifying thing, that we might have really quick changes in the future. Well, we almost certainly will have really quick changes in the future, both in terms of innovation and in terms of destruction. And as that window of time in the future, as we see less and less into the future, because this is getting faster, it becomes only more important that people begin thinking about the future. Because if you have a century's worth of change in the next 20 years, then all of a sudden it becomes much more apparent that you start thinking about the next 10 years, the next 5 years, because it's going to be so much more change in the last few years. So I think I made my point there, but that's the basic idea. And I think that's validated by just historical trends. If you study energy production and consumption, if you study reserve currencies, if you study, political leaders and military sizes and relative size to each other, I think it's pretty clear that the turnover is getting faster and faster.
Yeah, so we talk about this turnover and speed and the rate of the turnover, and speed of adoption and speed of destruction. I mean, the internet, I haven't run the numbers, but I don't think it's fully adopted.
Correct.
I don't know if everyone's,
yes.
I don't know if the whole world's literate or not. I'm assuming not. And there's still radios and radio stations and newspapers, and even like newfangled mediums of radio. I don't know, iHeart Radio or whatever is out there, or Sirius or whatever that is called today. So where are we on these kind of adoption curves with literacy, with the internet even? What does that mean for sort of the rate of adoption with Bitcoin, and even where are we in some of these like destruction curves? I mean, are we going to have radio for another 200 years just for a lesser degree? We're going to have newspapers for, I'm making, 27 years, or is it 27 more months? Like, do these things ever go to zero when they get destroyed,
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the only respectable answer is that who knows as far as how long do these things last? Because, I mean, how do you predict that? I mean, ultimately, well, let me back up here. I think it's important to remember, both for me and for everyone listening, that every technological paradigm is inherently larger than the previous one. So if we think of maps, you have all the value of all the paper maps in the world from 50 years ago. And then you have Google Maps and Apple Maps and smart maps, and these maps are so much more valuable than everything that was before, because not only do they tell you where to go, but you don't have to spend 3 hours to plan out your journey. It tells you every turn you can make. It gives you a real-time GPS location. It talks to you. It tells you what to do. You can talk to it. And along the way, it can tell you where gas stations are and where you can park up, where there are cool attractions or whatever, and all that. So, the new system is so much more valuable than the old one. And likewise with radio, we're talking about that. It's like, radio is great. There's this famous video of David Letterman and Bill Gates talking about it, and David Letterman's like, so it's basically the radio. And it's like, yes, it's the radio, but it's so much more. The internet is not just new radio. It does 1,000 times as much. And that's why it's so much more valuable than today. And so I think it's important to remember that all these things build atop each other. And so you asked specifically about the internet and all that. The internet is roughly at 60% adoption today. So there's almost half of the world does not use the internet, or perhaps has never even used the internet at all, not even once. And even within that 60% adoption, I mean, let's be real here. There are lots of people that use the internet every day that are not using it to its full potential, or don't really comprehend it or whatever. And so even though there's 60% adoption of the internet, I don't think 60% of the world is using the internet like someone in my demographic or someone in my age group here in the West might be using it. So the internet, that curve is roughly at 60% adoption, 65%. The computer itself is 87%. Here, I have this pulled up actually, because this is a future thread of mine that I'm referring to. But the computer itself is about 87%. So that includes cell phones, because those are computers. That includes personal computers. So basically 9 out of 10, or 8.5 out of 10 people have access to that. So of course that makes sense. The computer's been around longer, since 1948. It's had more time to be adopted. The energy grid, so basically people that have access to electricity, energy, depending on who you cite, who you source, and what you define as the grid, is in the low 90s. So 92, 93%, somewhere in that area. So roughly 9 out of 10 people have access to some form of the energy grid in the world, or their local energy grid. And then roughly 19 out of 20, or 95%, people have access to some form of transit, whether that be public transit, private transit. Obviously, most people do not have their own cars. Most people are using public transport. And there are people that don't have that. That's the 5 to 10% that don't have that. But all that to say is that we in the West are so spoiled and privileged that we like to think that, oh, everyone has these things, when in reality, there are billions of people, hundreds of millions of people that don't have access to these very basic things. And the fascinating thing to me is that it doesn't always make the most sense, because more people with cell phones and toilets in the world. So it's like you would think that because toilets have been around for so much longer that there'd be a higher adoption rate of those. But that's not always the case. So obviously this isn't a universal rule. But I think the idea makes sense that, as I've explained before, what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is monetary energy. And in order for that to survive, it has to be built atop the internet. Because if money is information, you have to have an information communications network, which is the internet. And that can only survive atop computers. And computers are exchanging or turning electricity into computation, into information. And then below that, you have the energy grid itself. It's able to turn the natural wealth of the world, as Henry Ford described in 1921, into electricity. So that, those four levels, I suppose, of adoption make complete sense. That on top of the adoption curve of the grid, then you have the computer, then you have the internet, and then you have Bitcoin on top of that. So yeah, to answer your question, roughly half, over a third, but almost half the people in the world have access to the internet. And so I think that's really important to emphasize for people, is that you don't have to wait for Bitcoin to reach 80% adoption to see the world change. Like Bitcoin could legitimately reach only 10% adoption, and the world has changed so much more than we can possibly imagine. By the time Bitcoin's at 40%, 50%, or 60% adoption, I mean, banks will be long gone, probably, more or less, or at least as we can conceive of them today. Perhaps they evolved into some form of future bank, like a CBDC. Perhaps they all just die, or at least the vast majority of them. But by the time that 1 in 5, 1 in 4 people in the world are using Bitcoin, the change we will see in all facets of society, I believe, will be completely different. And I think the internet emphasizes that. 10 years ago, the internet had changed the world, and it was far lower than 60% adoption 10 years ago. So, yeah.
Yeah. So further thinking through, adoption rates, what are political currency units?
That's funny you asked it. That's one of those things I just said on Twitter or podcast, or I can't remember now, casually, but now it's like actually become a thing. That's like my term. I guess it's being adopted. I love it. But yeah, so we think money, we think cash. That's what our brains are trained to think. Again, it comes back to the Matrix. We are trained hundreds of times a day. Literally, like most adults think about money hundreds of times a day. And when we think about money, we think cash, we think dollars, we think bank accounts. That's what we think. And my commentary there about political currency units is emphasizing the point that yes, those things are money. Cash is money. But a more accurate statement is that it is a number within a ledger that is controlled and manipulated and survives as a function of a given political regime or a given political institution. And that, perhaps there's a better term for it, but I think that's the best one. And I think it's important to remember that the US dollar does not survive as a function of the US government surviving. It functions as a survival of the US government's current monetary standard. So, for example, you had pre-1913, before the Federal Reserve, that was one monetary standard. And then before that, we had multiple monetary standards too, but that's, hundreds of years ago. But, you had the one monetary standard before the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve created in 1913. Then you have the Bretton Woods Agreement from 44 to 1971. So that's, about 30 years, just under 30 years or so, that we had the Bretton Woods Agreement, that monetary standard. And arguably that's one of the best monetary standards we had. Obviously that's very debatable, but, that was post-World War II. That really made sense. That worked because the United States had so much more energy, again, energy and technology after World War II. So much of the world was destroyed. And now we had the thermonuclear bomb. That's a massive form of energy. So we had military energy, we had economic energy, we had societal energy, we had the baby boom. So we had a growing population. The United States had all this energy flowing to it and flowing out of it. And it, again, thinking in terms of living organisms, it was the organism that was just dominating the world, late 40s, 50s, 60s, even early 70s, let's say. And, what happened is that eventually we got cocky and we liked having all this energy and we just assume it can go on forever. And we want to create things out of nothing. We want to have more energy without putting the energy required to create it. And so what we do, we decide to print monetary energy out of thin air without putting any economic energy into it. And that's where we have the monetary standard change in 1971. And now you have political currency units that are different than the previous currency units. Like the old ones are gone. And that's what people don't realize because we're in the matrix and we're used to thinking about money equals a piece of paper. It's like, no, money equals that monetary energy, and that piece of paper represents a given kind of monetary energy. From 1970 to 1972, even though it's the same dollar, they're entirely different forms of monetary energy because what's backing them is entirely different. You had the gold standard before 1971, where what was backing it was this form of metallic gold that was dug out of the ground, and the monetary premium people were given that over thousands of years. And then after that, all of a sudden, you have the full faith and credit of the United States, which was already insolvent then. It's much more insolvent now. It's probably going to be even more insolvent in 5 years. Obviously, he's recording this. The debt ceiling is a major talking point. That we have less than 30 days until the Treasury runs out of money. But yeah, all that to say is that political currency units is a term that I think is a better one than money. And while fiat is an equally good term, I think that goes over people's heads. So again, kind of like going back to this whole idea of the movie, is that trying to present these ideas in ways that make sense to people. You say fiat, most people are like, you mean like vroom vroom, like the car, beep beep? No, yeah, people think of a car. But when you say political currency units, those are three words that people understand. They understand politics and what that is, and they have an emotional reaction to that, number one. Then number two, you say currency, so you're separating the term currency from money. And then third, you're saying units. So that it itself is not the monetary value, it's just a number that is currently being ascribed to monetary value. And so I think it's a useful term because it emphasizes to people that your money is not money as you think about money. It's not inherently money. It's simply a number on a ledger that we're using as currency that's surviving on the basis of politics and politics on a national scale and international scale. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but that's where the idea came from, and it's really stuck. So hopefully it will continue to be of use to people, and if someone has a better term, hopefully that'll catch on too. So
Sure. Well, I wonder though, do you draw it's interesting how you used political currency units to describe fiat. But I wonder if fiat is still inherently different than political currency units, and maybe a sub group, in the sense that, did we have political currency units before 1971, 1913, when governments could clip a gold coin, and you didn't know, or you couldn't do anything about it, even if you did know, maybe. And there's still sort of corruption around gold, even though gold was the best money we had. So then from 1971 on, if you draw that distinction, and talking about, again, just fiat though, political currency units, but this kind of political currency unit, what do you make of the speed of adoption? Was it adopted? Was it rolled out and enforced? Either way, what do you make of the speed of that adoption because it almost seems like 100% of the world uses fiat. I'm not aware of anywhere I would go and use something else like seashells or even gold or silver.
I would say it's adopted. It wasn't a technological adoption. It was pretty much instant, that all of a sudden everyone's money was instantly converted out of gold certificates into fiat certificates. So it was adopted. I would say it. Adoption doesn't have to be organic. That happened to be inorganic adoption. So yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make for people, because most people think, oh, the dollar's not going anywhere. It's been around hundreds of years. No, not really. The dollar as we know it today has only been around for 52 years. So it's like, most people that are in their 60s and 70s don't like Bitcoin because they're like, oh, well, the dollar's been around. It was around when I was a kid. It was around when my parents, were young. It's always been here. It's always going to be here. It's like, yes, you're probably right. The dollar will probably continue to exist in the future. However, the monetary energy that backs that dollar very well might be different. If you were born in 1943, you've already lived through like 3 different monetary eras in the United States history. And honestly, the United States is only 250 years old, and we've had, depending how you want to count it, like 8 or 7 different eras. So it's like, this idea that the piece of paper is the same at any given time is simply not true. At one point it was redeemable for gold. Now it's redeemable for more debt. And so what happens if the dollar exists in the future, but all the monetary energy and all the debt that backs the dollar as we know it today rolls over and changes? I think that's really important for people to realize. And yeah, in a similar way, I think the adoption of that change, quote unquote adoption, I think could be much quicker than we perceive, because again, it's not organic adoption, it's simply by decree. There's nothing stopping the United States government, there's nothing stopping the rest of the world from simply changing what backs their currency. And I want to make one thing clear too. I know you didn't ask this explicitly, but I want to say it because people often twist my words online on Twitter. Like, I don't think that hyperinflation in the United States is inevitable in the immediate future. I don't think that it's going to collapse. And, I have a much longer time frame than that. But the point at emphasizing the dangers of the dollar is not to say that the United States is in worse shape than the rest of the world. That's an ignorant position. That's a incorrect position. And people often think I'm making that claim because I talk about the dollar. And the point of talking about the dollar uniquely in comparison to everything else is not making the absurd claim that it's higher risk than all the other fiat currencies in the world. It's making the point that the dollar has a lot more risk than what most people realize. And all the other fiat currencies have exponentially more risk than the dollar. That's the point that needs to be made. That, there's over 100 fiat currencies in the world. And the safest one, the US dollar, has lost 98% of its value in the last 100 years. It's probably going to lose at least 99% of its value in the next 100 years, assuming we don't have hyperinflation. If we do have hyperinflation, it'll be 99.999% of its value will lose in the next 100 years. It'll probably lose 50% of its value in the next 5 to 8 years or 10 years or so. I mean, it's really not that complicated. I think it's important viewing that in relation to everything else, that even though the dollar is the best fiat currency and there is no second best fiat currency out there besides the dollar, is that the case is still so bad for it. Who wants to hold their dollars over the next 8 years? Who wants to do that? Most people that don't even understand don't want to do that, because we all can tell that the dollar is just in trouble. And so anyway, that's a side note I wanted to make there, that I think some people have trouble understanding that being bearish on the dollar is being inherently more bearish on all the other fiat currencies in the world. Why? Again, because all these other nations are producing and consuming less energy than the United States. The United States is the largest living organism, metaphorically, on the planet. It's the most powerful military's most powerful economy. And so the probability of the dollar dying and going to zero is much lower than all the others. But yeah, sorry, I went on kind of a little side note there. But your other question too, about how long do these things last? I think they can last a long time. People still use the radio. People out there still don't have toilets. People don't have, just because the technology is new and its adoption rate is exceptionally fast, and just because, even if a technology becomes 95% adopted, that, the last 5%, the last 10% can take a long time. Unfortunately, many people in the world still can't read. The printing press has been around for, 600 years. I mean, it's if you look at S-curve adoption, the first group of people, the first 1 to 10% or so, that takes a long time and not much in the world changes. And then the last takes even longer, the last 5 or 10%, that takes an extremely long time, because it becomes, exponentially more difficult to get the last few remaining people on board with something. But that middle S-curve, that's where the majority of the change happens. And when it comes to Bitcoin, I think that's probably going to be the late 2020s into the late 2030s or early 2040s or so. I think the end of this decade and next decade is going to be radically transformative, because that's when we'll ascend that S-curve of adoption and change, not necessarily price, although I think price is aligned with that. But I would make that clear, that's an adoption curve, not a price curve. So yeah, hopefully that's interesting. I've said a lot there.
No, it's very interesting. You went on to tweet. I don't know exactly when you tweeted this, but Federal Reserve over the last 7 days expanded their balance sheet by 300 billion. That could pretty much be only 7 days these days. That is 11.5 million Bitcoin. There are only 2 million Bitcoin left to be mined, and maybe 2 million on exchanges. And whatever has not been lost can always be put up for sale. Most of it's being held to maturity at this point, but you get the idea. And then what happens? You went on to write, what happens when every central bank prints every week to purchase Bitcoin, that ever shrinking number, and you're saying get off zero?
Yeah.
It's just fascinating how many political currency units are just coming out of the printer. And until the world, because I do believe that Bitcoin represents value in the world and not these PCUs, but until Bitcoin absorbs all that value and energy, it's obscene how much political currency units, how just liberal and free flowing these things are. But to maybe put things in a different perspective and shorten her horizons, not too much, about 100 years or so, but how does Bitcoin save 100 million lives in the 21st century alone? I mean, we're talking about saving lives, or reducing starvation,
Yeah.
war, the environment. Let's dive into this.
Yeah, reducing preventable death and suffering. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's so much there to unpack. I guess the first thing to say is that what makes Bitcoin fundamentally different than all of the forms of money and PCUs and fiat currencies, cash. What makes it fundamentally different is that, at least up to this point, there is zero corruption in its ledger. So why, again, coming back to the dollar, why do people trust the dollar? Why are American stocks monetized more than stocks anywhere else in the world? Why do people want to park their cash in the United States? It's because the United States government is the least prone to corruption in the world. And obviously US government's corrupt. People probably hate me for saying that, but that's true.
Right.
Do you trust the United States government or some nation in Africa or some nation in Europe or some nation in South America? That's not saying that, those places are any worse than we are.
I'd also argue the more cash you have, the more you can probably trust the United States government.
Yes, yeah, correct. Yeah, of all the governments in the world, the United States is the least corrupt one, at least from a monetary perspective, the least probable to just completely collapse and go to zero. And so all these fiat currencies can easily just be replaced by, like, let's say, for example, a government came along that was managing a country more or less a similar size to the United States, the same amount of energy, same kind of technological progress, population, all that, and their government was just less corrupt. All the monetary premium would flow to that government because its underlying ledger, its currency, inherently has less corruption, less distortions from reality, and therefore a lower probability of just vanishing than the US dollar. And that would just collapse the US dollar. That would, just cause the feedback loop to go off forever. Obviously, there's no country that fits that role, but the point being, that's the separation between Bitcoin and all these other things. How do you make a better fiat currency? You make a fiat currency with less corruption. How do you make a better Bitcoin? We don't know how to make it because there's zero corruption thus far. It's like the metaphor from an engineering perspective, between a rocket that flies up versus one that's in orbit. How do you make a better rocket? Well, you make one that flies up higher. Okay, it's very easy to make a better rocket then. How do you make a better satellite if the satellite already orbits? It's like you kind of already achieved that. And that's with Bitcoin. What makes it different than all these other things is that it doesn't have that corruption. Because it doesn't have that corruption, because it's in orbit, it isn't going to come back crashing down to Earth like rockets do. And so why am I so confident it's going to save tens of millions and possibly even 100 million lives or more this century, in the next 77 years? It is simply because the fundamental base layer of society is money. Money is the thing at which we exchange value, and everything we do in our lives is in exchange for value, whether it's family or work or religion. Money is a communications mechanism at which society determines what is valuable. And if that is being distorted, if that's being corrupted, if that's being manipulated, then fundamentally you're breaking down communication at every level of society. You're breaking down incentives at every level of society. You're breaking down culture at every level of society. You're causing all these problems because they're built atop an underlying distortion in reality, or distortion that society's reality. Again, societies are just energy. They're balls of energy in competition with other societies and empires and nations that are also balls of energy. And if your nation has a fundamental distortion in its monetary energy, which is the base layer of all other forms of energy in that society, it's destroying itself and withering away. It's entropy. It's self-fulfilling. And so all that to say is that that's the beauty with Bitcoin, and that by simply fixing that one problem of removing corruption from the monetary level, or getting that proverbial rocket to orbit and creating a closed system in a world of open systems, by simply solving that one problem, you indirectly solve dozens, if not hundreds, of other problems in society. Earlier today, someone was just telling me, oh, college is so expensive. It's horrible. Back in my day, college wasn't that expensive. Back when I went to school, this was someone that was older. And, obviously I didn't say anything there, but it's like, why is college tuition so expensive? Why is food production so bland today and so filled with artificial, sweeteners and carbs and corn and soybeans? Why is our food getting worse and worse, even though our technology is getting better and better? Why is it that polarization in our government is so much worse? Why is it that the news cycle is so much more doom and gloom? Why are people so much more terrified of climate change, of war, and all these other things? I think if you really boil it down, all of these problems are either caused directly by corruption in money or being compounded by it. So, for example, just to run through, I'm probably going to offend a lot of people here, but just to run through some basic ideas here. One of the biggest problems with climate change right now actually is that our incentives are being completely misaligned at all forms of society. We are taking down nuclear power plants, we're taking down clean, efficient energy, and we're resorting back to fossil fuels. This is complete madness. The best way to upgrade society from a previous form of energy into the next form of energy is to maximize use of its current form of energy so that we can afford to upgrade. You don't get the developing world to adopt nuclear power plants by saying you can't use fossil fuels and you got to starve. In the meantime, you cut down your forests in order to burn them. This is one of the things I was doing in Guatemala, was that we were helping the locals there upgrade their energy production and consumption away from deforestation, cutting down their local habitats, into having stoves. And some people would critique that and say, oh, now they're using more energy. And yes, they're using more energy, but it's a more efficient form of energy. In the same way, you don't get people to the LED light bulb by saying you can't use light bulbs because they use too much energy. And instead, you should just go kill a bunch of whales to light your homes. It's completely nonsensical, because as we upgrade forms of energy, they become less destructive on the planet. And so, that's more of a side note. But point being that our society is channeling massive amounts of fear towards both climate hysteria on one end and then also denying the climate on the other end. And that's also as a basis because of polarization in the world. You saw it with COVID, you see that right now with politicians, and every facet of political life and every political issue, people are diverging, become more and more polarized. And this really shouldn't be surprising. We saw this too with the Nazis, in Germany in the 20s and 30s. You had people polarized to the communist side and the fascist side. The fascists went out over the communists. And then, of course, the fascists collapsed and then everything swings over to the communist side in the later 20th century. But it's all the same thing, that as you destroy the base layer of trust, the base layer communications mechanisms of society, what happens is that people need a scapegoat. They need somebody to blame. And in the case of the Germans, they decided we'll blame the bankers, we'll blame the Jewish people. And then obviously that leads to corrupt incentives, and you get someone in power that's corrupt, which causes more corrupt. And, everything just continues to deteriorate. Or in the case of the communists, you want to blame the capitalists, you want to blame the rich, you want to blame, owning your own property. So instead, let's just take your property, redirect it towards the state, put a bunch of money on you, and it's just corruption that feeds upon itself. So in regards to climate change, we're dramatically misallocating resources, destroying our own energy production. We saw it with Europe this last winter, and then now with the Ukraine war, we're seeing all these forms of energy destruction in the name of using less energy, which actually is very destructive to society as a whole. We see this in our political sphere. And because we have that breakdown of energy and that breakdown of trust, we see that in our social media feeds. Now that everyone's scared, articles and headlines that are clickbaity and get you to have a little bit of fear, those cause people to click more. And when that happens, what happens? You have anxiety compounding, ADHD compounding, depression compounding. So really, what's the basic argument as to why I think Bitcoin could save 100 million lives? I simply did the arithmetic. This is a thread I did on Twitter. I encourage people to look it up. It was one of my earlier threads. I think a lot of people haven't read it actually, of how Bitcoin could save 100 million lives. I basically did the arithmetic. What if Bitcoin could reduce the amount of suicides and anxiety and depression in the world by a couple percent? What if Bitcoin could accelerate our adoption of renewable energies by 10%, let's say? Or take World War III. Bitcoin is a form of a non-violent weapon, a shield, essentially. And so what if Bitcoin's global adoption lowers the probability of World War III by 5%, let's say? How do you aggregate out that total number of lives if we assume that a war like that would claim 100 million lives or something? What about lead poisoning? There are a million people that die every year from lead poisoning. There are a million people that die every year from not having enough energy to heat their homes. They die literally from the cold. There are millions of children out there that don't have access to medical treatments. What happens if productivity gains of society can actually flow to the monetary layer of society, meaning that medicine can advance faster and faster and prices can collapse faster and faster? What happens if housing becomes cheaper over time? Education becomes cheaper over time. You cause all these things to move in the right direction instead of the wrong direction, simply from changing incentives and simply from removing corruption from the equation. The total aggregate number of human lives that could be saved, or perhaps better put, is that the number of preventable deaths premature deaths that are completely avoidable, I think is easily in the tens of millions, very likely in the hundreds of millions. And then if you go out more than just the end of a century, the implications are really massive. There's a huge amount of life depending on this. And I mean, if we think about our own privileged Western lives, how much of our year do we spend directly going to taxes? It's like, okay, you spend 2,000 working hours a year. Let's say your tax rate's 30%. What is that, 600 hours? Like 600 hours of your life every single year, maybe more like 700 once you include other forms of taxes and sales tax and accounting and doing, hiring your CPA and all that, for pretty much every American, 500 to 800 hours of their life every single year is going directly to government subsidization, of which 90% of that is complete waste. Obviously, some of it's not complete waste, but the vast majority of it's complete waste. And so how can that many lives be saved? What if every nation in the world suddenly was not having all their people being stolen from 10% or 8% or 3% or 20% every single year? I mean, the implications are really massive. And anyway, I believe that the single most pressing problem for society today is that we are operating atop a corrupted ledger. And I think that solving that problem is the number one goal, no matter what your other goal is. I think that's the easiest way. If you want to solve climate change, or solve is I don't really like that term, but if you want to reduce the amount of pollution that we're putting in the environment, Bitcoin should be one of your top priorities, even though that doesn't make sense to a lot of people. If you want to prevent war, whether that's revolutions or smaller wars today, or a theoretical World War III in the future, I think Bitcoin is a high priority for you, if not the top priority. And all these other issues you've already laid out. I think when people really go down that rabbit hole, kind of like we were saying earlier, you could go down 100 different rabbit holes with Bitcoin. I think that's because money is the base layer of all these other rabbit holes of society. So, the arithmetic is really promising. If Bitcoin just has a small % chance of surviving, there are millions of lives, I think, that directly and indirectly could be benefited here.
I feel and think that way too. And to kind of read a little bit from that thread, how much is 2.5 trillion man hours of excessive monetary debasement waste? That's 4 million lifetimes of working hours every year saved. Sounds crazy, but think about how much society wastes on fiat mindset now pacing the corruption of the ledger. It's insane. With just 500 hours a year, per adult, 25% working hours, that's 2.5 trillion hours per year. And you also tweeted, you'd rather be young with 0.01 Bitcoin than Michael Saylor with 100,000 or more than 100,000 Bitcoin. But, I want to tie in a few other ideas here. You also went on to say somewhere, prosperity for the middle class 60 years from today is likely to be much more than prosperity for the billionaire class today. Would you rather be middle class in 2023 or a billionaire with 1940s tech? It's kind of interesting forward and backwards. And so, I mean, is this true? Would you rather have 0.01 Bitcoin than, 138,000 Bitcoin, in the company you run and partly own, and several tens of thousands in your own name, or 0.01 and 24 years old?
Yeah, I love that you're bringing up all the controversial things. I've had I think 3 tweets that have been extreme negative reaction, and that was one of them. You're like, what on earth are you talking about? You're high, whatever. You're an idiot. But I mean, and to be clear, I'd rather have 130,000 Bitcoin than,
I don't know.
a million cents. But yeah.
I don't know.
The caveat there.
The caveat is age here.
Yeah, the caveat
and
is
you
age.
Can't buy time with Bitcoin.
Exactly. You can't buy time, number one. But number two is that you can't buy the prosperity of the future because it doesn't exist yet.
So that's two things I want to talk about. Yeah. I mean, CK was just on my show, and I mean, okay. There's no one that's bullish enough on Bitcoin. And his point there is, and 0.01 is a good number, but he's saying even if you have less, like 37 sats, at some point in the future, this is going to be generational wealth. You can wait. And on the other hand, no matter how much Bitcoin you have now, you need to get it to the future. Your Bitcoin and your family safely. Whether that means, don't over leverage, don't leverage at all. Maybe don't gamble your Bitcoin. Don't lose your Bitcoin. Don't trade your Bitcoin, whatever it is, and safety, physical safety in the real world, take care of yourself, your health. You got to get yourself, your family to 2030 with everything going on in the world. And, if Bitcoin goes where we think it is, 0.01 is a lot of Bitcoin. We'll get into that in a little bit. But then there's also this idea of just, poor people today are better off than poor people of yesterday. So maybe we could dig into that, both those things.
Yes, I think, and I think the reason why this caused such a negative reaction on Twitter, honestly, to my surprise, I didn't think it would be nearly negative reaction it got, even from Bitcoiners, which, again, it's not saying that I'm inherently right and they're inherently wrong. It's just, it was surprising to me because I thought the argument itself would make sense. But what is the argument? Argument being that future technology, it brings more prosperity than current technology. So, like, for example, I can talk to 10 people a day from different countries, you being one of them, whether it's Australia or somewhere in Europe or Africa, like the gal I mentioned earlier who reported show, it's like 100 years ago, it would have been incredibly difficult to talk to 10 different people with 10 different backgrounds, growing up in 10 different cultures in a single day. Like, that's conservative. You could talk to 50 people a day via Twitter or via email or something like you can gain so much more from other cultures today simply because technology's enabled it. We're not in person. This will never replace in-person discussion, but for all intents and purposes, this is so much better than no communication at all, like what you and I are having right now. And not only that, but there are probably 100 or a few thousand people that will watch this into the future. Maybe they'll watch it a day in the future. Maybe they'll watch it 100 years in the future, but they get the benefit from it too. So not only do we get the benefit of communicating with people that before this technology we never would have been able to communicate with, but we get to communicate with anyone from time. I can't talk to Abraham Lincoln, but I can listen to Michael Saylor podcast. I can, watch a conference with Steve Jobs. I can listen to these people and get as close as I can to being in the room with them in real life. Again, that doesn't replace it, but that's to say that I have access and you have access, and everyone watching this has more access to the top minds in the world today than people would have 100 years ago. And forget 500 years ago, the odds of you talking to someone that was well off is extremely low. You didn't get to talk to the monarchs of the day. You didn't get to talk to the people calling the big shot. You just didn't get to do that. Maybe in your small town at one point, someone that, was successful in the day's age might have walked through. You might have gotten to speak with them for a few minutes. The amount of information we've access to is so much better. Or one of my favorite examples is anesthetic. It's like, do I really want to be king of England 300 years ago? Like, what happens if I need surgery? I mean, I'm not that much of a wimp, but I mean, I'm a wimp enough that it's like, I don't think I could do that. I don't want to go through a surgery, fully awake, fully aware of what's going on, and hope that they don't kill me in the process. That even if they don't kill me in the process, and I have to go through all that pain, and yeah, I still might die at a young age. I mean, it's like, today, pretty much everyone has access to anesthetic. And it's like, you can have surgery basically pain-free, surgeries that weren't possible. You don't have to go through all that discomfort. Oh, and if you get an infection, it's not the end of the world. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, look at smallpox. Look at AIDS. Look at measles. I mean, look at all these diseases. Look at cholera, malaria. Malaria was a huge one. All these diseases that today are not nearly as huge of a deal as they were 50 years ago or 500 years ago. It's like, I think what most people look back to in the past is they look back with nostalgia, but life was simpler. And where life is simpler, you didn't have all this technology, you didn't have all these gadgets. And I think fundamentally the problem, what they're yearning for is not the technology of the time. They're yearning for the simplicity and the peace of mind. And really you can have that today as well. And so I think that's where the disconnect is. But yeah, I think it should be obvious to most people that prosperity today for the middle class person, like, we have access to so much more stuff than people 50 years ago or 80 years ago. Yeah, I might not have 100 libraries or streets named after me, like a president or a king, of the ancient world, of the former world, but I do get to live a long life. Odds are I'll probably live a longer life than most of those people, and I don't have to go through half the difficulties they had to go through. I get to eat better food than they did. I get to eat the food I want more than they did. And yeah, that's the basic point between the 0.1 Bitcoin and the 100,000 Bitcoin. The numbers are irrelevant, but the point stands. If I'm 60, 70, 80 years old, let's be real here. The probability, well, let's see, how do I put this without offending everyone? Let's say at some point in the future, we find a way to have life extension technology. Right now, most people live to 70s or 80s or so. What if, in say a couple of decades, we find a way that can extend human life another 20 years, like good quality human life? And perhaps we won't even extend human life. Perhaps we just find cures to cancer, find cures to Parkinson's, find cures to Alzheimer's, diseases that tend to onset in the later third of life. What if all those advancements happen in the next 30 years? Or let's say 30 years from today, let's say all those things are cured from some magical innovation we can't conceive of yet, or at least mostly cured, maybe not entirely cured. It's like, if I'm 60 years old or I'm 80 years old, the brutal truth is that, the probability is much lower that they'll live to that day than someone who's younger. So likewise, for example, if we're talking about maximizing the amount of time that one is alive on Earth, like improving their statistical probability of having the longest duration of life and the highest quality of life, in pure terms of prosperity, not in terms of happiness or satisfaction, but purely in terms of prosperity, the dominant factor is how young are you? It's not how rich are you. It's not even where in the world you are. Both of those things are really important. It's what century are you born in and how far in the future do you survive? Because the longer into the future you survive, the better the technologies are to aid you in life and aid you in your family's life and aid you into the future. So that's the basic idea there. And I want to be clear that everyone dies eventually. But I think fundamentally, if we're thinking in terms of what is the purpose of saving money, the purpose of saving money is to have the longest, happiest, healthiest life that we possibly can. And in that case, it's better to have less money now and more time into the future than more money now and less time. And no matter what way you look at it, I believe.
I agree 100%. I think that if you're 25, at some point you're 25 and you work 25 years, you're 50 years old and you obtain $100,000 Bitcoin worth of value. And which is a lot of money. You have the opportunity to trade it all for 0.01 Bitcoin and 25 years of your life back. Well, you get to bet on three things there, which I think are very interesting. You get to bet on yourself again. And in this bet, you don't get to bring your money or your knowledge or wisdom. You're going back to 25 without the money and the experience. But you're still your 25-year-old self who once did accomplish this in some portal, and you might be able to do it again. You could bet on yourself. Two, you get to bet on Bitcoin. You get to bet on the future value of Bitcoin, and you get to bet on time, the future. And what I think is really interesting there, what you bring up, so as if you're that 50-year-old person now in 2023, when you can make this bet today, and you go to 25 years old, but it's 2023. It'd be interesting if the average person making somewhere between 20,000 and 100 grand a year today lives like someone who has $1 billion today in 25 years.
Yeah.
So in a way, like part of the bet could be, I might not have to do anything to get all my prosperity back.
If
Just
you're
because
saving it in
I'm
Bitcoin.
buying,
Yeah.
because well, maybe even if you don't save in Bitcoin, maybe the world moves to a Bitcoin standard, and there's so much prosperity that 25 years from now, the average working person has the lifestyle of a billionaire today. In terms of prosperity, comfort, security, maybe land allocation, home, lifestyle, whatever.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting if you could just even be like, I'll give up the money just to get the time, and the time itself would bring me back to my prosperity that I'm experiencing now.
Yeah.
But I think the time is more
point.
valuable either way. The only place I might disagree with you is if you are king. I think even if it's a short period of time, that's a priceless experience that is even above certain levels of wealth. That I think some people would trade years for. Maybe I don't know. You get into like you're in a club of like 1,200 people out of 9 billion, or actually not 9 billion today, of whatever there's been before you and today. You're in a very small club with
Well,
probably very unique experiences.
I think that's a good point, but I think ultimately it just comes down to, is your definition of prosperity status and influence and reputation, or
No, in
is
this
your
case, it's not. Well, yeah. So, meaning, in 25 years from now, you might not have the status of a billionaire, but you might have the house of a billionaire, or the
yeah,
technology of a billionaire, or
yeah,
the personal toys, or whatever it might be, the yacht, the boat, just
mhm,
because of the value created in society, maybe the time freed
yeah,
up in
yeah,
society, just without even you being on a Bitcoin standard, the world being
yeah,
on one. So there's three bets there. You're betting on yourself, you're betting on Bitcoin, or you could bet on just time. But
yeah,
you get time back, which I think is, at some point, Bitcoin can't buy you time. It can
yeah,
buy you, it can't buy a time back. It can help you reclaim some of your time, present and future, but it can't literally buy your time back. So moving on from that, uh, let's see where we could go. Well, that kind of brings me to, what kind of optimism are you feeling as, a Generation Z or Zoomer in today's world? So, you know, um, it seems like the climate's a bit dark. Yeah, if you want to frame it even in the fourth turning, it seems like we're in the turning. It seems like it's very chaotic. It could be very confusing maybe if you don't have the knowledge that you have walking through all this. So, what kind of optimism do you have? What kind of hope for the future do you have?
yeah. It's really interesting. Obviously, my age group, I think, has a lot more pessimism than probably most demographics. Um, but if we think about this from first principles analysis, what fundamentally are they worried about? Well, their main concerns are, number one, the environment. Almost unilaterally, that's number one concern of people my demographic, which is why it's important to talk about, I suppose. The climate is a major concern for them. Um, Politics is a major concern from them. The conservatives are concerned of communist dictatorship from the left, and the lefties are concerned about a fascist rise up from the right or whatever. So politics is a major concern of my demographic, as well as equality of different social groups, classes, whatever you want to call them. Those really, as far as I can tell, those are like some of the big ones that really worry people, and obviously racism is tied up into that as well. But fundamentally, what are those three concerns? That comes down to equality, that comes down to polarization, and that comes down to energy, because the climate issue is fundamentally an energy issue. That's inherently what it is. We just like to call it the climate because that's easier to conceptualize. It's easier to think about trees and animals than the complicated nature of energy production or convoluted, implications on the environment and ourselves because of that. So those three things fundamentally, I believe, the problem underneath them all, those each have their own, they're each a block of society. The fundamental problem underneath those, or the way at which to increase, the way at which to have the most optimistic outcome in all three of those things is improving the money. Because if you can improve the money where there is no corruption, or at least it's incredibly expensive to corrupt, you suck all the air out of the room for politicians trying to exploit that. Why is there such a vested interest? Why does it matter so much who's in charge of the country? It's because there's such a massive economic implication from who's in charge. The president, the previous president, Donald Trump, he printed a whole bunch of money in regards to COVID. President before him, Barack Obama, you have Obamacare, and now you have Biden with the 100,000 things that he's doing, and probably whoever's up to him will print just as much money, or more, or in some way will continue the funnel of monetary energy and distortion into the future. Why? Because they essentially have to. And so basically you could think of all these politicians as chess pieces atop the board, the chessboard of money. And these chess pieces can manipulate the rules of the board to give them strategic advantage over where they are in relation to everyone else on the board. And if you change your base layer of money, and now all of a sudden the chessboard has a consistent set of rules, well, now all of a sudden the incentive in betting on the right chess piece just goes out the window because all of a sudden everyone has an equal playing field, which, by the way, leads into that other issue of equality. You could talk about racism, you could talk about rights here, rights there, privacy, whatever. All those issues come down to equality, essentially, or the ability for everyone to have the opportunity to improve their lives and better their lives. It doesn't matter how racist or non-racist your society is. If you can't save energy into the future, which is what we call money and saving, then does it matter to a certain extent? Does it matter where you are in the communistic to democracy spectrum if you can't save money, if you can't save energy into the future? Life is energy. If you can't save energy, you can't eat. Who cares if it's a democracy or decentralized government if it's a centralized monetary standard? And then, obviously with the climate, which that's perhaps the most controversial thing, and I won't dive into that too much, but it's like the same thing. Like I said before, we have massive misaligned incentives at the governmental level and at the societal level of distorting reality. We're destroying our food production, which is actually accelerating the negative impacts we're having on the climate. We're having massive pollution of the world. CO2 is an issue, I think, and this will be controversial. I think the much larger issue than CO2 is pollution in regards to plastics, in regards to lead, in regards to toxic chemicals. I think those are much larger issues than CO2. Obviously that's up for debate, depending who you ask, but I think those problems are much harder to reverse than, say, CO2. But anyway, all that to say is that how do I feel about being optimistic or pessimistic? In general, I'm quite optimistic because all those problems are easily solvable. It is very easy to solve climate change. All you have, well, again, I don't like to say that phrase. I really got to get in the habit of not saying that because climate's always going to be changing. You can't solve something that's perpetually changing. Our negative consequences on the environment that might have negative externalities we might not be fully appreciating. I think the best way to mitigate that is simply to upgrade humanity to a better source of energy. Obviously we're eventually going to run out of fossil fuels, and obviously fossil fuels have a negative impact on air quality, breathing quality of the world. And so I think the most optimistic thing is to assume that humanity continues to upgrade our energy sources to better forms of energy. People can debate which energy sources those are and what relation those energy sources are, but eventually we'll upgrade. We have to, one way or another, if we assume we continue to the future. So I think there's reason to be optimistic for that. I think there's reason to be optimistic that polarization will decline. I think there's reason to be optimistic that society will be more equal than it ever has before in human history. And I think the practical thing that is optimistic in all those facets is fixing the incentive structure of society, which is fixing the money, which is, finding the best proof of work ledger without corruption, which, that is Bitcoin. The thing I'm least optimistic about is the transition to that. I think the biggest problem would be a theoretical third world war. Whether it's nuclear or not is irrelevant. I think either way it would be a major disaster on equality, major disaster on the environment. That's the ironic thing. One more thing about the environment is that we're so focused on plastic straws and these things that frankly don't matter. It's like if you're pro environment, your number one goal should be preventing World War III. It's like, yes, carbon's important. Yeah, sure, maybe cow farts are important. I tend to doubt that. But your number one goal should be preventing war, because war would be disastrous on the climate. In addition to everything else, like that's the small thing which is disastrous for it. It's in terms of starvation, in terms of famine, in terms of all these other negative externalities. It's so much worse for that. But that's a little bit of irony there. I think very frustrating to me that my generation, in their fear and in their angst and in their paranoia, we like to do little things that we can fix. And obviously there's value in those, but I think we sometimes miss the forest for the trees. And it's like, really, fundamentally, I think most people my age are very pessimistic because they think there are all these different problems. There's a dozen different problems and they're all catastrophic and they're all getting worse or whatever. When in reality, there's just one major problem, society speaking, in terms of society. There's just one problem, and the solution is there, and it happens to be this Bitcoin thing. And in buying it, you can enrich yourself, you can enrich other people in the world, and you can increase the probability of good things in the future and reduce the probability of these bad things in the future. So yeah, I think there's reason to be pessimistic. I think probably the top reason to be pessimistic is war, because humans can act irrationally and because the people in charge of the weapons have the greatest incentive to act irrationally. But I think in general, I'm very optimistic into the future. And people call me naive and, online, and perhaps I am, but I mean, what's the other option? So far in history, every generation building knowledge on top of each other, every adoption curve building a previous one, every single one has been beneficial to humanity. And fundamentally, it's easy to get scared because our problems of the future inherently are orders of magnitude bigger than our problems of today and our problems of the past. However, I think it's very easy to forget that the tools at which we will have to address those problems of the future are inherently much better than the past. So all it says that, yeah, that's a major source of my optimism, both because of Bitcoin and because humanity finds solutions. And it's encouraging that people all the way back in the early 20th century understood these problems, and they understood the Bitcoin, or what now we today call Bitcoin, was a major solution for those problems, which again comes back to the movie and why I'm making this movie. I think, even besides Bitcoin, yeah, it'll create thousands of Bitcoiners, hopefully, and increase conviction or whatever. But ultimately, this movie's going to be really optimistic. It's going to talk about the collapse of fiat currencies and all that. But, a big point of the movie is going to be that the demise of fiat currencies and the banking sector is something that's actually really optimistic. It's like the demise of bloodletting. It's like the demise of the ancient world of surgeries or whatever. It's like, saying that all current knowledge of surgical practice is going to go away. And people view that as a negative because, that means that we're not going to get surgeries anymore. We're all just going to die. It's like, no, that means that something new is going to replace it. And that something new is going to be so much better than what we could perceive of previously. So yeah, that's a big part of the film. The film is going to be very optimistic, and it's going to address many very pessimistic or very concerning topics, but from that perspective of monetary energy and from that societal perspective, and explain how this one problem is the matrix, title of the show, that if we can find a way to alleviate that problem, or at least reduce it, then we could have these second order effects and everything else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate the optimism. I definitely feel the worry and the pessimism in the world. Yeah. You tweeted, the U.S. national debt doesn't matter. This is because the currency we denominate that debt in doesn't matter, and we can borrow as much as we want because of that. Increase debt forever until market accurately reflects the dollar, and the debt doesn't matter, and it is made up. In another tweet, if we have banking crisis during Biden's term, he isn't getting reelected. Ukraine, inflation, and social issues aside, banking crisis, higher voting priority. People wouldn't realize that this is not Biden's fault, but that's irrelevant. Biden will keep begging Jay Powell to stop. And then you went on to tweet, and I thought this was really interesting. The only people that should be worried about Bitcoin are those that own 0.0000000 BTC.
Yeah.
So I want to ask, are Bitcoiners risk-averse people? I mean, most of us think of us as moon boys and, lump us in with JPEG freaks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, most of society views us as extremely high time preference, trying to get rich quick, put in $5, make $1 million kind of people. And those people are in the crypto space. That's what the majority of proof of stake chains are trying to do. Not all of them. Some of them do generally think that they're having low time preference, but the vast majority of altcoiners are high time preference. But the vast majority of Bitcoiners are extremely low time preference, and that there's Bitcoin, there's everything else. I mean, that's one of the things that I think has caused people to find interest in me, is that it's like I have all these moon boy numbers of $1 million of Bitcoin, $100 million of Bitcoin, or perhaps even more in the future, almost certainly more in the future. But fundamentally, at the same time, I'm talking in terms of hundreds of years, which is also, over the heads of some people. But I think it's important to view it that way, because that's fundamentally what you have to understand. You have to understand where we've come from, where we're going, and then you can understand, okay, well, it's obvious that the problems of today are this, because we're transitioning from this ancient world, we're going into the modern world. And so, of course, all the growing pains from this world to that world have to be exactly what we're experiencing in this current moment. Previous world is thousands of years of burning things for energy, wood, fossil fuels. Now we're transitioning out of that slowly, but it's like, well, then of course the issue of this century, the issue of this time that's of course going to be the environmental issue of our day, or take the monetary thing. We've government after government after government after government for hundreds of years, and now we're transitioning to the first and perhaps only electric money in the world. It's like, oh, of course, this whole Bitcoin banking crisis, of course, this is going to be the problem of our generation. So all I have to say is that are Bitcoiners risk averse? I think at first perhaps not, but eventually they do become so. Like I don't want to buy bonds not because I won't make any money from them, but because I don't want to speculate in them. I don't want to speculate in government promises in which I don't trust. I don't believe I will ever trust. I'd rather just hold my own information. I'd rather just, hold my own keys of my Bitcoin. I'm risk averse. I don't want to speculate in investments when I can just own money. And that's one of the things people don't understand is that when you buy Bitcoin, if it is the global monetary black hole that we think it is, when you buy Bitcoin, you're taking profits. People think that they're buying Bitcoin and they'll sell it later for profit. It's like, no, when you buy Bitcoin today, you're taking profits. Think in terms of stock market. You put cash into the stock market, stocks go up, you take your cash out, back out to your cash, which is money in the old world, in the ancient world, and that's your profit. You've now profited more currency units because you've sold. And when it comes to Bitcoin, Bitcoin is the money. All these other things are the assets in the world. When you sell assets for Bitcoin, what you're doing is you're taking profit on your assets in terms of Satoshis, in terms of Bitcoin. And into the future, the Bitcoin denominated value of all these assets will continue to collapse 80%, 90%, again, every 3 years perpetually. And so that's essentially what you're doing, that you're taking profits when you buy Bitcoin. I think people have trouble realizing it. And I think once that clicks, then they become more risk averse and they have this risk averse perspective. And that's one thing I think is lost on people, that there are some people who go all in Bitcoin because they're trying to make a quick buck. But then there's other Bitcoiners that go all in because they have a time horizon of 10 years and they believe that everything else is higher risk and lower returns. And so therefore, everything else is infinitely worse when it comes to your risk adjusted returns. So yeah, bonds are asymmetric downside, Bitcoin is asymmetric upside, and everything else is somewhere in between. So yeah,
I can see that. And then switching gears a little bit, but back to what we were talking about before with political currency units and just even just sort of the climate today and what we were getting to there is like, why does every president have to become more controversial? And is Biden more controversial than Trump?
I think he is. Perhaps people disagree with me on that, but I think he is. I mean, I think we tend to forget things in history. Like, let's not forget Obama. Obama was a very populist president in a similar way to Donald Trump. He did it very differently. Trump did it much more in trying to get people riled up and intentionally saying controversial things in order to get more airtime. It worked very well for him. He got elected. He still has a massive following today, the people that are diehard Trump folks. But Obama was the same way. Obama really brought people together on extremely wide ideas that were very radical. And that's the same is true with Bush. After 9/11, we had blatant lies about weapons of mass destruction and about invading the Middle East, and we did. And I would argue that Obama was much more appealing to the masses than Bush was. I think Donald Trump was also populist in that sense, trying to appease the masses, although he did it through more division. And I think Biden is doing a very similar thing. Perhaps he's not as controversial in his speech, and perhaps he's not trying to be as controversial like Trump is. However, let's look in terms of policies. Biden is pushing forward radical legislation. And again, this isn't a anti-democratic thing. There are plenty of people that are progressives that are Bitcoiners, but it's just to say that I think that has to continue, and perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps hopefully next election we get someone that's a little less crazy. But I think no matter what, one way or another, we have to keep printing money. We have to keep debasing our debt, and I think as desperation increases as a result of that, I think politicians will have to cater to that increasing desperation in voters and in folks. And when society already is using less and less energy and it's already on that decline for a period of time, it becomes just much easier to steal from other people instead of create new value. And that's pretty much what we have going on right now. Most legislation passed today is in regards to theft, whether that's theft from everyone via inflation or that's theft from one people group to another. Our policies today are much more grounded on taking more from the current system and redistributing it than expanding the system in its entirety. And that's a really big problem. And that's a feedback loop that's very hard to stop, because once people go down that rabbit hole of political extremism and victim mentality, I think it's very hard to reverse. And this is true both in the left and the right. I have my political leanings, but that's largely irrelevant to the point. So perhaps there are periods of time at which it gets better, but I think one way or another, the deterioration of the chess pieces atop the chessboard have to get worse as the chessboard itself becomes more corrupted.
Right. Yeah, and we're all gonna have to live through that. Unfortunately, I think.
Yeah, which again goes back to war. That's like I said, it's my major concern, is that society reverts to war faster than society understands Bitcoin. Because once you understand Bitcoin, you understand that it's stupid. But for people that are in that matrix, in that mentality, I think war becomes justifiable, frankly, in many people's minds. Which makes sense in historical context. Like, it makes sense historically that we should have a major war in the next couple of decades, I think. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable guess. Even, Bitcoin aside, monetary events aside, to me that makes sense. As much as I hate to say that. And I'm optimistic. I hope we don't have that. But this period of time post World War II is uncharacteristically long in the world. And I think there's reasons why it's very long, but I think some of those reasons are ending. So yeah, that's enough about that.
Yeah. Then why is the locomotive your favorite metaphor for Bitcoin?
It's my favorite for multiple reasons. Number one, because the horse was the dominant form of transportation for thousands of years, and then suddenly, by putting a hunk of metal together, that completely destroyed that. And now, just 200 years or so, we pretty much forget that the horse and our feet were the only ways to be traveled, or maybe by wind via boat. But yeah, the locomotive gave rise to the airplane, to the automobile, and to all the other forms of technology for transport that we have today. The locomotive is largely responsible for the Industrial Revolution. And the locomotive, another thing that's really important about it that I think we today fail to realize, is it was multiple game-changing systems in one. It was the first mass transit system in the world. Before the locomotive, the idea of mass transit did not exist, because you can't fit a large number of people on the horse, neither practically or efficiently. But the locomotive was the first that did that. And in the same way, I think Bitcoin is the first nonviolent weapon projection of power in cyberspace. And this is credit to Jason Lowery's thesis and Saylor's commentary on digital energy and everything like that. But I think that's what's hard for people to realize about Bitcoin. That yes, it is money, but it's also this whole other thing besides money that's so much bigger than money itself. Locomotive eventually replaces the horse, yes, but it's so much bigger than just the horse, because it's that first mass transit system that previously we have not been able to conceive, because it is that form of massive industrialization. Unlike we can see, the locomotive makes the assembly line possible. It makes all these other things possible built atop of it that we don't currently have today. And then also, just because it's a striking metaphor, it's like saying that, if we spent 1,000 years trying to breed the perfect horse, and then suddenly you have a locomotive. It's like, like if say you and I, you have your horse, you have your diversified portfolio of bonds and stocks and gold and real estate, and that's worked for thousands of years. To your credit, you're very smart. It's a beautiful stallion. It's better than I could ever do. You're far smarter than me. You're far more educated than me, far wealthier than me, whatever. But simply by me understanding what a locomotive is, I've completely obliterated your entire worldview. If you have your horse run at full speed against this locomotive at full speed, even though it's only going at 20 miles an hour, and in the future they'll go 200 miles an hour bullet trains, this locomotive, as primitive as it is today, as basic as it is today, crushes your horse and turns it into a pancake. Because why? It channels energy better than the horse. It's a more massive thing. It has more momentum. It moves more efficiently than the horse does. And because of that, if you put them head on, one just flattens the other. It's not even a question. Those are some reasons why I like the locomotive as a metaphor. Another one is just personally, I like trains, and to me that was a major moment in human history. And I think, for example, the Continental Railroad in the United States here was finished in 1869, and we landed on the moon in 1969. So just over 100 years later. I mean, that's something really radical to think about. That in basically 100 years, we went from not having the transcontinental railroad completed to landing on the moon. And I think that's an excellent metaphor of what if today we're in that moment where the Golden Spike's going in Utah, and we are just finishing the proverbial transcontinental railroad today, and in 100 years, it's going to be so beyond our comprehension that it's basically impossible to explain to somebody from today. So those are some reasons. There are more reasons, but I think those things are really important to help people understand that if you don't understand Bitcoin yet, it's not because you're stupid. It's not because it's a get rich scheme, that it's like these big term things. It's simply because it's a form of technology, and the implications of the technology are solving problems that we don't even realize we have, number one, and number two, solving problems that don't even exist yet. Again, one more thing about a locomotive is that if you're living in the era of horses, you don't realize that the horse is a problem. You don't realize that the horse is a limitation, because in your worldview, it's the best you have. And so you don't view it as a negative. You don't view it as a problem. But with the invention of the locomotive, all of a sudden, the horse is an immediate problem, because of the locomotive being so much farther. Now we have, transportation. We go anywhere in the world. And, basically these new paradigms of technology create problems that were not there before, and there are the solutions to those problems that weren't there before. And the inferior technology simply can't compete. And so, that's why hyperbolic chart with Bitcoin, again, one of my most controversial tweets, that's why that makes sense. Because if this is a superior form of technology, which it may not be, it is, but it may not be. If that's the case, then the inferior technology simply has to continue to trend to irrelevance on the global stage, theoretically forever. I mean, the light bulb is forever increasing in dominance against the candle. The locomotive is forever increasing in dominance against the horse. It's the same idea. So yeah, that's why I like that metaphor, because I think it really clearly gives a visual aid in helping people understand the game theory of Bitcoin, and helping them understand that it's okay to not fully understand Bitcoin, but it's not okay to continue writing it off as nothing. Because if this is actually something, your horse is a pancake.
Yeah. Wow. You tweeted, most people will never own 50,000 sats in their lifetime. The cost to acquire 50,000 sats today is $13.43, give or take a penny or two. So with that in mind,
now, but yeah.
No, I updated your number.
Okay. Wow.
Hey, it was $11.93 when you tweeted it.
Oh my goodness. That's crazy. Okay.
With that in mind, have we ever really known what money is before Bitcoin?
No, I don't think so. And I think that's controversial for people. I think it's hard to accept, because it's basically saying, again, we've been living in the matrix this whole time. But I think that's actually the case. In the same way, I think the printing press revealed to the world that, oh yeah, most of us don't know how to read. Everything I just said with the locomotive is true with the printing press too. It's like we didn't realize that not being able to read was a problem. I mean, obviously it was a good thing if you could read, but we didn't understand it in the same way we do today until we had the printing press, and you could read. And now all of a sudden, as society upgrades and now everyone can read, it becomes a larger problem that you can't read. I think it's the same thing with money. I think Bitcoin is the first uncorruptible money that humans have ever had. I think it's the first, which ironically makes it probably the only in the future, but I think that's so far over time horizon, who knows? But I think it's the first. Like, Bitcoin really is the first money we've ever had in a very real sense. And everything else is a proxy to that money. In the same way that a locomotive is the perfect horse, or the airplane is the perfect bird when it comes to transportation. In the same way, I think this whole time we've been basically doing alchemy and trying to put together diversified portfolios of creating this perfect money where, because what do investment managers do? They charge you 2% a year to take your economic energy and put it in a mixed basket of goods and securities and commodities or whatever. and basically create a portfolio that they manage that proxies as the perfect money for you. It's something with the least amount of risk possible and the most amount of upside possible that's reasonable without gambling or without putting all your trust in one place. I just described Bitcoin. It is designed to be the lowest risk thing possible with the most amount of upside possible without excessive risk of fractional reserve lending, and you diversify your trust across the entire globe. It's like that's the revelation that most people are yet to have. And that's why people will spend years and years and years with a 0%, 0%, 0% allocation to Bitcoin. And then, boom, in a couple of years, their entire worldview changes. And then they're like all in Bitcoin. It's like we see that consistently. I've talked with multimillionaires that have gone through that. I've talked with broke college kids that have gone through that. I went through that. I'm sure you've gone through that. Probably everyone you've talked to in your podcast has gone through it. It's like that same thing. We have very little understanding of the locomotive. We don't get it. And then all of a sudden we understand, oh, okay, I get it. This makes everything else irrelevant. And now it makes no sense to hold anything else. Now it makes no sense to have scrolls now that we have movable type. It makes no sense to have to kill a bunch of whales and force whales to extinction now that we have the lightbulb. It's like, oh, now I get it. It makes sense. And so all it says is that, yeah, I think it's very possible that Bitcoin is the first money that we really have, or the first, perhaps not the first money, but the first perfect money that we have. I do think that's extremely probable.
Yeah. Also, something that's really come through with your work is you seem to be a little bit worried about people who aren't catching on. I know we're very early, tremendously early, but for people who might be thinking, am I too late now? What about the people who more like, can you be too late to Bitcoin? Will there be a point where it's too late to exit cash? Are you worried about people in that situation?
This is one thing that's hard to explain. I think people have trouble understanding what I really mean here. So I guess I'll just try to give the juxtaposition best here. I think it's never too late to adopt Bitcoin in the same way that it's never too late to just integrate with society today. It's never too late to do that. However, it is too late to exit the old system. So like today, if you're, let's say you're a rice farmer in China, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, whatever. It's like if I brought you today, like your old knowledge, your old skill set, your old assets, it's all worthless now. You could be the wealthiest farmer from 1,000 years ago with entire sheds of rice and storage, and you have connections, reputations, you have a skill set that you've worked up for 40, and now it's irrelevant. It's like, what do? Your rice is worthless because it's just dropped at 100x or probably 100,000x in value over the last 1,000 years to be teleported to today. Okay, and your job is now worthless because it's like, all the rice farmers today, they just run a tractor or press a button, and you're meticulously, it's your skill set, your savings, the assets you held, all that has just collapsed because it's reliant on a technological paradigm that no longer exists. And so it'll never be too late to adopt a Bitcoin standard because theoretically all future paradigms can be based atop the Bitcoin standard, because right now technological paradigms are in conjunction with the monetary standard of the time because we have various forms of corrupted money today. But the implication of an incorruptible money is that all future technological paradigms, the productivity gains of those paradigms fall back into the money. So theoretically, into the future, if Bitcoin is what we think it is, it doesn't matter where in the future you go, as long as you understand Bitcoin and you're a part of that paradigm, then all future paradigms are denominated into that, which is perhaps a bold claim. However, I think it makes perfect sense because we're entering the point at which the speed at which paradigms are adopted is so fast that we inherently can't keep up. And so we inherently then have to discover technology that can offset that. And I believe that's Bitcoin. But yeah, I don't believe it'll be too late to adopt Bitcoin. However, I do believe it will be too late to exit fiat, to exit bonds. This is one of the fears people have. What happens if the government bans Bitcoin? It's like, yeah, I think the government will ban Bitcoin. Just today, Jamie Dimon was talking about how he wanted to ban Bitcoin short selling of bank stocks, which is absurd, by the way. And if you own bank stocks or you own, anything that Jamie Dimon touches, that's probably a little bit of a concern. But I think it will be too late to exit fiat. But let's do one more metaphor with the locomotive and the horse. Let's say you're betting on the future of the horse and I'm betting on the future of the locomotive. Right now the locomotive is tiny in comparison to the horse. and you don't understand the locomotive, whatever. As soon as the locomotive crosses over the hill, and now everyone can see the locomotive, everyone understands the horse is done. And so even if the horse still is the dominant means of transportation of that day, the future value of it is already gone. And that's what people don't understand with bonds. Yes, it's entirely possible that bonds go away far into the future. However, if people understand today that its future value is just going to disappear, the market will price that in today. It's like the same thing with gold. What if in 100 years, let's say, we begin mining asteroids or the moon, or we find a way to get gold from the ocean, or we'll find more ways to get gold. We're finding more gold every year. We're making more gold every year than we were making every 10 years, a couple of centuries ago. We're making more and more gold exponentially as we have a greater need for gold for our computers and for our technologies. And what happens when everyone understands that, oh, okay, the supply of gold is only going to continue to increase exponentially forever. It's like, well, the market's going to continue to price that into today. And so, yeah, in regards to fiat, I think it will be too late for people. And I think the unfortunate reality, and people may say I'm too pessimistic here, I think in reality, probably towards the end of this decade or in the 2030s, the vast majority of people will lose the vast majority of their net worth in the fiat, or whatever fiat instruments they have, whether that's CDs, bonds, investment real estate, stocks, whatever. I think the vast majority of that monetary value is just going to evaporate as the world begins to accept that this is a superior monetary technology. I think that's probably inevitable, and I think that governments will do everything they can to stop the transition. And the easiest way to stop that is just to eliminate convertibility. We saw it with FDR. We saw it with Nixon in 1971. It's like, what happens when people are converting their dollars into gold? You cut the conversion from dollar to gold in a temporary measure. And now 52 years later, that temporary measure is still here, and we're never going back to that. So I think it's the same case. And that's why I encourage people to get off zeros, because once you understand Bitcoin and you understand, even if this isn't what happens, the probability that a government or all the governments in the world eventually realize this and begin printing their own currencies into oblivion to buy all the Bitcoin that are left, that's a very high probability. I think it's a very probable probability. And why is that? It's because basically what they're doing is they're dooming themselves in, that they are destroying their old system in favor of the new system. Again, locomotive and horse. You might think the horse has a long time to survive, but what happens when all the nations realize we have to get a national rail system immediately because all these other nations are doing it? And if we don't upgrade to the locomotive, we will not be able to transport soldiers. We will not be able to transport food supplies to the soldiers, and we will not be able to transport the military equipment along with the soldiers. And by the way, we will have a smaller economy than our competitors, so that our government and our military, it's like in every way the locomotive upgrades the society from one technological paradigm to the other. And in them investing and adopting that future one, they have to destroy the old one. In governments adopting a locomotive standard, they have to destroy stagecoaches. They have to destroy they have to divert resources away. And it's the same thing with Bitcoin. As governments begin to adopt Bitcoin, what they are doing is they are destroying the fiat system that they've operated upon. And that's what's so frustrating me. People say, oh, well, the government will never abandon fiat, blah, blah, blah. It's like, you're right from a previous worldview, but now with this new worldview, it's like they will destroy themselves. That's what most people, even Bitcoiners, I think, don't understand that if Bitcoin is what we think it is, governments will destroy themselves as fast as Bitcoin destroys them, and perhaps even faster, because they'll realize the faster we can destroy our own technological paradigm and adopt a new one, the better positioned we are into that future world. And so, anyway, all that to say is that, yeah, I think probably most people won't figure it out in time. I think they're going to be, over the next 5-10 years, more people will figure it out. They'll get off zero, they'll get prepared. And then everyone else will just have to do what we've done for all of human history and just suffer the consequences of our actions, lose all of our monetary premium in a previous paradigm, and just have to start from zero, new paradigm. Most farmers lost their jobs in the Industrial Revolution, and most of them had to start from zero, learning a new set of skills and holding a new set of assets. And I think it's probably going to be the same thing here. And frankly, when it gets to that point, I probably won't be educating people nearly as passionately as I am now, because frankly, at that point, it'll just be too late. And that's a sad thing. Too late for them to preserve what purchasing power they have. They'll be able to get new purchasing power via proof of work, but Yeah, at a certain point, it becomes too late.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope. But to kind of think about, something like a 6102 or just, something you wrote was the price is always set at the margins. Bitcoin is designed to have
Yes.
exponentially tighter margins of supply forever. So I just think about all those things as making the margins tighter and slimmer and
Yeah,
thinner.
yeah, yeah. People do not realize how. Yeah, people don't realize the implications of that. Even Bitcoiners, I think. Yeah, people don't realize how scarce absolute scarce money is. Why? Because we've never had absolute scarce money before. And so all the biases and preconceptions we have of not finite money, we're projecting onto Bitcoin, and it's simply not true. You can't ask the question, how is a locomotive going to run? How do do you have to have a horseshoe for a locomotive? It's a nonsensical question. So anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I kind of cut you off there,
No,
but
no,
yeah.
not at all. You kind of called him JP Diamond. I think we should stick with that. I think that works. But thinking about sort of numbers and odds and completely going different subject here. What do you think are the odds that aliens exist?
Wow, that's way out there. Um, yeah, that's a question. Um, yeah, I don't know how much we want to go down that rabbit hole. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people watching this are sure aliens exist. I'm sure other people think they don't exist. I have my own thoughts on that. I think the only two possibilities are number one, aliens don't exist, or number two, we are at the very beginning of the universe's total existence, and just simply from game theory, there are grabby aliens and non-grabby aliens, and we are at the very beginning of that transition. And so then inherently, we're probably going to. But basically, the only two scenarios are that there are no aliens, or if alien life is possible, then it's almost certain that we become an intergalactic civilization. I think those are like the only two extremes. I have my own leanings on those, but I've thought about it a lot, and I think most people's preconceptions of aliens are probably wrong. I think the idea of Star Wars or even Star Trek is just absurd. It's like, no, if an alien civilization is 100 years ahead of us, it's like we have no chance. Or if we're likewise 100 years ahead of any other, they have no chance. Like even today, if there's another Earth out there with other humans, like if they're just a few 100 years behind us, it's like we will eventually force them to be extinct. It's too bad for them. But yeah, I think people like to think about aliens because it makes for good movies and it's good storytelling. But I think most people are thinking about the possibility of alien life entirely wrong, and I'm geared to think that alien life is much lower probability than people think. That's just me.
I hear you. So before we roll out, I want to read a little bit more from your thread on how Bitcoin could save 100 million lives in 21st century.
Sure. Yeah.
What to do? Buy Bitcoin to lower the probability of thermonuclear war. Buy Bitcoin to crash the price of food, shelter, and medicine towards zero. Buy Bitcoin to reduce pollution. Buy Bitcoin to help families spend time together instead of chasing yields. Buy Bitcoin to reduce Amazon rainforest destruction. Buy Bitcoin to reduce friction of upward economic mobility. Buy Bitcoin to separate money from state to force the marginal cost of energy production towards zero. Buy Bitcoin to defund the war machine and tyranny. Buy Bitcoin like all the wealth you've ever made depends on it. Buy Bitcoin like your life depends on it. Buy Bitcoin like your children's future depends on it. Buy Bitcoin like 1 billion people's lives in 2300 depend on it. Even if it doesn't, the odds are high enough. We have less in common with the future than we do with the past. Bitcoin is a bridge to get there. So, along those lines, if you could orange pill anyone in the whole world, who would it be?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, yeah, first to comment on the reading is like, yeah, that's why people think that this is a cult. Because it's like, okay, sure, you think your magic internet money solves everything. It's like, yeah, okay, right, kid. But, I do think that's the case. I thought this was crazy at one point, but if you can just remove corruption from if I believe all humans are sinful, all humans are corrupt, and we are always going to have that corruption. And so we cannot fix that. We cannot be our own savior. And that's where Jesus comes in, but that's a more religious thing. If humans cannot be our own savior, we have to have a technology that can function without human oversight. Because if you have human oversight, we will corrupt it and we will destroy society. And because society is changing at an exponential pace, we will destroy it. We will recreate and destroy it faster and faster and faster. And the death toll of that only gets significantly worse. How do you explain the Holocaust to somebody from the year 1600? How do you explain somebody that was in Auschwitz the nuclear bomb? I mean, and likewise, World War III is concerning, but World War IV should be even more concerning, or World War V, or World War VI. So I'm glad you read that. I've not reread that in a while, but yeah, I think that's true. That you can solve or at least alleviate many problems simply by buying Bitcoin. Likewise, the mission trip to Guatemala, it's like, yeah, you can help the Guatemalans by going down there yourself, like I did, and installing stoves, and that's wonderful, and people should do that. But you can also help them just by advancing Bitcoin, because the farther you can advance Bitcoin, the less power you give the United States government and the Guatemalan government the ability to steal from the Guatemalans. So, I'm glad you read that. I appreciate that. Now the other question: who would I orange pill? Bitcoiners will probably hate me saying this, but well, it depends what the goal is. If the goal is the fastest Bitcoin adoption possible, then I'd probably orange pill somebody in the United States government, Department of Defense, or White House, or Congress. I mean, somebody in there. Why? Because the faster, again, going back to the metaphor of the locomotive, if you cause them to understand that your survival and the future paradigm is dependent on you transitioning, what are they going to do? They're going to transition. I mean, if there's only 1% chance this is true, they're going to start because they have to. They can't afford not to. And that's what people miss. They think, oh, the United States government will never adopt Bitcoin because they're going to do everything they possibly can to retain power. It's like, yeah, you're correct in your statement, just your conclusion is wrong. Yes, they will do everything they can to adopt Bitcoin, and they will not crash the dollar for any reason other than to adopt Bitcoin, I believe, intentionally. So probably some of the U.S. government, simply because if you orange pill them, then there's nobody in the world that can weaken confidence in fiat currencies faster. There's nobody in the world that would have a higher incentive to transition than them. Yeah, Sailor has an incentive, I have an incentive, but the people with the highest incentive, with the most to lose, are those in charge of the fiat currencies. And again, that's what people fail to realize, is that they will put it off more than everyone else because they have the largest stake in the current system. But when that current system begins to be in free fall, they'll be eager to transition because they'll have to. They'll simply have to, as soon as they kill their egos, which may be for a long time. But so if my goal is fast adoption, that's probably what I would do. If my goal is the lowest probability of conflict, then probably I'd want to orange pill someone in the developing world. We're recording this in 2023. 5 years from now, if the block reward will be 225 Bitcoin, which is 22.5 billion Satoshis. And so for 8 billion humans, more or less, that's like 2.8, 2.815, 2.81, something like that, Satoshis per human per day. Or excuse me, I said something wrong there. That's not the block reward. People understand what I'm saying. I said that wrong. But in 5 years' time, let me say it correctly here. In 5 years' time, there will be 225 new Bitcoin issued per day, which is 22.5 billion Satoshis. And so for 8 billion, 9 billion humans, that's under 3 Satoshis per person per day. And that is a terrifying thing, and it's a beautiful thing. It's terrifying because that's 3 Satoshis. That's what, a tenth of a penny today is 1 day's worth of Bitcoin per person in 5 years, not 50 years, 5 years. That's deflation. That's real deflation. And that means the terrifying thing is that kind of deflationary force we've never experienced before, which means that it will force asset prices to just continue down in Bitcoin denominated terms faster than I think we can perceive today. So it's terrifying if you own stocks and bonds and gold, but it's very exciting if you own Bitcoin. And for those in the developing world, it's very exciting because just for a few dollars, which for many people in the developing world, that's all they have. For just a few dollars, they can protect themselves as the rest of the world gets crazier. They can protect themselves and they can protect their family. And so, if you're someone in the developing world watching this, I encourage you, just one day's salary, whatever that is, I encourage you to buy Bitcoin and hold it in self-storage and forget that you own it, for a few years. And then, think about it some more, and if you just do that, if you just take a small allocation a day with discipline and you hold it with a long time horizon, you are far better protected than people 10 years in the future will be when they try to liquidate everything for Bitcoin. So yeah, it was kind of a long answer, but yeah, depending on your goal, either the people at the top of the fiat pyramid or at the bottom of the fiat pyramid, just depends what your goal is.
Yeah, for sure. So, Luke, this has been so dope. I'll leave it to you for any, parting words and let people know where they can find you and your work.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'll say this because we brought it up earlier. We brought this towards the beginning. But yeah, I am working on this film project. I do believe that it's important. It is going to cost money. We're trying to raise a good bit of money for it. So if people want to donate for the cause, it would mean a lot to me if they do. And long story short is that we're aiming for every dollar spent on the production of the film will hopefully have a reach large enough that it orange pills one person. So basically if you give $30, hopefully your contribution, if I'm successful and the crew is successful, will orange pill 30 people. So, if you spend 10 hours trying to orange pill your family, you can orange pill a stranger for $1. So we're trying to make something that's worthwhile and is a good use of funds. And hopefully it's use of funds for those new people. Hopefully it's useful to you watching once it's completed. And to people in the future, I guess one other thing to say about that is too that we're giving people credit. So if they donate 100,000 sats, they get credit in the film. So that's partially as a perk, as a reward, but it's also an orange pill opportunity because our hope is that once this thing is completed, someone will say to their family or their friends or coworkers or whatever, "Hey, look, I helped make this film possible. My name's in the credits. How cool! It's got 1 million views on YouTube or whatever." That might be something that gets someone over the edge. It's like, oh, okay, I'll watch it, whatever, and they start watching it. Hopefully, we've done a good enough job that they watch it all the way through. So, anyway, if people watching this would be willing to support, it'd mean a lot to me because number one, it's a passion project for me, but also because I do think it'll be good for Bitcoin education, and hopefully it will be good enough that the final product will be good for Bitcoiners too, at orange pilling friends and family and deepening their own convictions. So it's on Geyser. Hopefully people are aware of Geyser. You can find it on Twitter, but the wallet address is there. Yeah, if people are willing to donate to that, that'd be of extreme appreciation. But if they just want to follow me, learn more about me and the crazy things that I'm saying online, they can follow me on Twitter or they can find me on YouTube. I'm really expanding YouTube. Got a lot of really cool podcasts set up. Jeff Ttuth, Greg Foss, people from the developing world, bankers, CEOs, all that. I've got some really fun people lined up. So yeah, YouTube, Twitter, and then if they feel compelled by anything I'm saying here, yeah, if they want to support the film, that'd be appreciated. So yeah, thank you for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Luke. Really appreciate it. Yo, thank you for listening to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Big up to Luke Broyles for joining us today on unlocking the revolutionary impact of Bitcoin, and to our sponsors, River and CoinKite, for powering the show. If you enjoy the content, please support the show by writing a 5-star review on your podcast app. Spread the word to your friends and family. Stream and boost the show on the Fountain app. Send lightning tips on Twitter. This podcast is a labor of love and a passion project, so your support means everything. Keep learning, accumulating sats, stay grounded, and maintain focus out there. This is Cedric, your host of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast, signing off. Peace.